Beneath a sky swollen with ash and fire, the world teetered on the edge of annihilation. Roughly 252 million years ago, continents baked under relentless heat, oceans turned toxic, and every breath of air carried the weight of a dying planet. Life struggled amid storms, famine, and unseen killers, where survival demanded ingenuity, resilience, and relentless adaptation. Forests burned, rivers vanished, and predators prowled a landscape stripped to its bones, leaving only fleeting refuges for the desperate. Step into this nightmarish world and witness the fragility, terror, and astonishing persistence of life at its limits. Inferno rising, volcanic fury across the Permian. The land trembled as molten rivers tore across vast plains, carving channels in the bedrock that glowed with a deep, unearthly orange under a sky swollen with smoke. In the north, the eruptions of the Siberian traps unleashed sheets of basaltic lava that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, their combined volume estimated at over 4 million cubic kilometers, transforming the continental crust into a patchwork of molten rock. Ash and pumice exploded into the stratosphere, forming towering plumes that darkened the sun for months, scattering microscopic droplets of sulfuric acid that drifted across the continents, mingling with the scorching winds. The ground itself pulsed with heat, and in low-lying valleys, trapped pockets of superheated gas and pyroclastic flows swept indiscriminately through forests and plains, obliterating any creature or plant that dared remain in their path. Amid the chaos, plants struggled under conditions far beyond any they had previously endured. Glossopteris, the dominant seed fern of Gondwana, bore leaves twisted and scorched at the edges, its vascular system strained as sap boiled within brittle stems. Conifers such as Ulmania and Pseudovoltsia reached skyward in a desperate attempt to escape the smothering ash, yet even their towering forms could not escape the suffocating heat and acidic precipitation that fell from the sky. The chemical composition of the ash, rich in sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, created localized acidification of soils and waterways, causing root rot and the collapse of freshwater microecosystems, leaving amphibians such as Eriops and Archegosaurus stranded in dwindling pools. Animals that roamed the Permian plains faced an unrelenting gauntlet of fire, smoke, and toxic air. Large therapsids, like the carnivorous Inostrancevia, moved with wary caution through scorched terrain, their respiratory systems strained by airborne particulates and elevated temperatures that pushed thermoregulation to its limits. Smaller herbivorous dicynodonts, including Lystrosaurus, were forced to migrate in herds across barren land in search of the rare patches of edible foliage that had not yet been consumed or burned, often encountering lava flows and pyroclastic surges that split the ground beneath their feet. Even invertebrates were not spared. Dragonfly-like Meganeura found their flight curtailed by dense smoke-filled skies, while terrestrial arthropods scuttled frantically to avoid sudden bursts of molten rock or collapsing trees. The scale of the eruptions altered the atmosphere in ways that reached far beyond the immediate impact zone. Estimates from geochemical studies suggest that sulfur dioxide levels rose high enough to trigger global cooling episodes, even as carbon dioxide emissions drove greenhouse warming, creating a volatile climate oscillation that made survival increasingly precarious. The continuous injection of aerosols into the upper atmosphere blocked sunlight in many regions, reducing photosynthesis and destabilizing food chains from the bottom up. Algae populations in rivers and shallow seas experienced dramatic die-offs, which rippled through the aquatic food web, affecting early bony fishes and temnospondyle amphibians that relied on abundant primary productivity for sustenance. Rivers of lava did not only consume life on contact, They also reshaped landscapes, creating new mountains, altering river courses, and damming valleys that would later flood catastrophically. Pyroclastic flows carried not just heat but chemical toxins, leaching minerals into water systems and altering the chemical balance of the ecosystems they traversed. Sedimentary deposits of this period record thick layers of tuff and basalt, demonstrating the frequency and scale of these eruptions. Some layers suggest that lava advanced at rates exceeding several meters per hour, fast enough to outrun large terrestrial animals, but slow enough for smaller, burrowing species to attempt desperate escape through shallow tunnels, though few succeeded. Even creatures capable of burrowing faced immense challenges. Cynodonts and other burrowing therapsids excavated beneath scorched soils, yet the heat penetrated meters below the surface, while toxic gases seeped through fractures, making subterranean refuge only marginally safer. In certain basins, volatile gases accumulated, creating pockets that exploded with sudden force, tearing the ground and ejecting debris, a hazard that could strike without warning. The ecological pressure forced rapid behavioral adaptations. Nocturnal activity increased as the day became intolerably hot, and animals shifted to feeding on the few remaining drought-tolerant plants, intensifying competition and predation in already hostile conditions. Amid the eruptions, the very chemistry of the air and water became a weapon. Acid rains, rich in sulfuric compounds, etched leaves and corroded shells of freshwater mollusks, leaving entire riverine communities in collapse. Carbon dioxide concentrations reached levels sufficient to induce hypercapnia in larger vertebrates, causing disorientation and weakness that predators exploited. Evidence from paleosoil analysis indicates repeated cycles of extreme soil acidification, suggesting that these volcanic events were not isolated incidents, but prolonged eruptions spanning hundreds of thousands of years, imposing relentless stress on ecosystems across the supercontinent of Pangaea. Even the skies reflected the fiery torment below. Ash clouds reduced sunlight to a dim red haze, producing prolonged twilight conditions across much of the landmass. Winds carried embers and volcanic debris for hundreds of kilometers, igniting distant forests in a cascading chain of fire. Thermal currents from lava flows generated local storms, whipping smoke and ash into spiraling funnels, while lightning from charged volcanic clouds sparked additional fires in parched landscapes. The combination of heat, toxic gases, and reduced oxygen created a suffocating, almost palpable atmosphere, one in which survival required constant movement, vigilance, and extraordinary resilience. As the days of relentless eruption continued, the boundaries between land, air, and water blurred under the weight of heat, ash, and chemical overload. Life clung to marginal refuges wherever a river trickled through a valley or a patch of forest had not yet been consumed. The relentless, unyielding fury of the planet itself forced evolutionary pressures at an unprecedented pace, selecting for resilience, mobility, and rapid adaptation in creatures both large and small. In these moments, the Permian world became an arena of immediate and extreme survival, where fire and smoke consumed the horizon and the air itself became an oppressive, the suffocating force that foreshadowed the collapse of breathable air, leaving life teetering on the edge of annihilation. Breathless, the oxygen collapse. Shrouded by volcanic smoke, each inhalation became a test of endurance, the air itself opposing life with an invisible force. Oxygen levels had plummeted, estimates suggesting concentrations as low as 12 to 15%, forcing animals to struggle for each intake while carbon dioxide and sulfurous gases thickened the atmosphere. Across the scorched plains, herds of Lystrosaurus moved slowly, muscles quivering with every step, their lungs working harder than ever as the once familiar air betrayed them. The thickening sky muffled the warmth of sunlight, yet the relentless heat persisted, compounding the physiological strain on creatures already weakened by fire and chemical fallout. Leaves of Glossopteris and other dominant seed ferns curled and withered under the oppressive air, their stomata widening in vain to capture the dwindling oxygen. Even the towering conifers of the southern supercontinent struggled to maintain metabolic balance, their needles trembling in the poisoned breeze, shedding water and carbon in desperate attempts to survive. In lowland rivers and marshes, amphibians such as Archegosaurus and Eriops flopped and gasped, their gills and lungs straining against hypoxic waters, while freshwater invertebrates fled deeper currents in search of oxygen-rich microzones. The struggle was constant, subtle, yet deadly, as life teetered on the razor's edge between adaptation and collapse. Massive dragonfly relatives, the Meganeura, found flight increasingly laborious. Their enormous wings, once capable of gliding effortlessly above wetlands, now beat sluggishly against the thick, suffocating air. Even insects with high surface area respiration were slowed by hypoxia, forced to remain in shade or shelter beneath rocks and fallen trees. Terrestrial arthropods, which had thrived in previous periods of warmth and abundance, were now confined to narrow, oxygenated microenvironments, retreating from the open plains where predators prowled and every inhale demanded effort. Predators, too, felt the invisible hand of suffocation. Innostransevia and other large carnivorous therapsids moved with a calculated, frenzied patience, stalking weakened herbivores whose bodies trembled under the physiological weight of low oxygen. Their hunting strategies adapted. Attacks became sudden, decisive, and opportunistic, exploiting moments when prey gasped and faltered. Smaller predators, including gorgonopsids, lingered near water sources, anticipating prey drawn to the last oxygen-rich pockets of rivers and marshes, creating deadly ambushes that combined the threat of predation with environmental stress. Rivers, swamps, and shallow lakes became temporary sanctuaries, yet even here the air and water were perilous. Oxygen stratification created sharp gradients, the surface often richer than the depths, but highly unstable due to volcanic heating and microbial activity. Amphibians and early bony fish struggled to remain in these thin layers, while algal blooms, fueled by chemical runoff, created localized dead zones. Sediments indicate that thermal layers and chemical toxicity frequently shifted within hours, forcing life to move constantly or perish, creating a relentless cycle of survival under impossible conditions. Underneath the soil, burrowing species faced their own invisible perils. Cynodonts and other small therapsids retreated into tunnels, yet pockets of carbon dioxide and methane percolated through the fractured ground, making even subterranean refuge only partially safe. Temperatures several meters below the surface rose unexpectedly as heat from widespread lava flows radiated through the crust, while toxic gases seeped through faults, leaving the creatures to navigate a labyrinth of danger, both above and below. Behavioral adaptations intensified, nocturnal activity increased, foraging shifted to the coolest hours, and social coordination became critical to avoid suffocation or predation in these confined spaces. High-altitude refuges and elevated ridges became critical sanctuaries for certain species, where slightly higher oxygen concentrations allowed therapsids and early reptiles to breathe more efficiently. Fossilized growth patterns suggest that some dicynodonts increased red blood cell production, a physiological adaptation to counteract hypoxia, while smaller amphibians demonstrated rapid shifts in heart rate and respiration to cope with the thinning air. Even insects, such as primitive cockroach relatives, altered their tracheal ventilation, extending spiracle openings during cooler periods to maximize oxygen intake while minimizing water loss. These localized adaptations illustrate how life leveraged microenvironments and internal physiological flexibility to survive on a planet where breathable air was becoming a scarce resource. Even plant life revealed the unrelenting pressure of hypoxia. Stomatal densities in surviving species of Glossopteris and other ferns indicate desperate physiological adjustments, maximizing gas exchange while minimizing water loss. Photosynthesis slowed under the combined stress of low oxygen, ash-darkened skies, and high heat, reducing energy available for growth and reproduction. The collapse of plant productivity rippled through the food web, straining herbivores and, by extension, their predators, amplifying mortality across all levels of the ecosystem. Insects and smaller vertebrates exhibited extraordinary but often insufficient adaptations. Pelycosaurs, small amphibians, and early reptiles demonstrated increased lung surface area or intermittent aerial exposure to maximize oxygen uptake. Yet these strategies came at the cost of vulnerability to predators and environmental hazards. Even the giant dragonflies adjusted their flight patterns, staying near oxygen-rich wetlands and avoiding long-distance excursions, highlighting the interplay between physiology, environment, and survival imperatives in a world where air itself had become deadly. Volcanic gases continued to dominate the landscape, carrying sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and other noxious compounds far beyond the eruption sites. The mixture of heat, chemical toxicity, and low oxygen created a planetary atmosphere in which survival depended on mobility, timing, and the ability to exploit transient refuges. Herds moved along shrinking rivers, amphibians clung to narrow swampy corridors, and flying insects hovered over the last patches of oxygen-rich air, each species responding in real time to conditions that had transformed familiar lands into a suffocating labyrinth. Every inhalation demanded effort, every movement tested endurance, and every environmental fluctuation represented the difference between life and death. Shadows lengthened over parched valleys and scorched marshes, accentuating the fragility of existence in this collapsing world. Yet even in this suffocating, chemically laden atmosphere, life demonstrated persistence. Small pockets of survival formed in water, shade, or burrows, setting the stage for the next desperate fight against the Permian nightmare. The thinning skies pushed creatures ever closer to aquatic refuges, but as they reached for the tenuous relief of rivers and marshes, the looming threat of deadly waters, oxygen-poor and toxin-filled, hinted that the struggle was far from over. Dead seas, acidic waters, and suffocating currents. As animals pressed toward shallow waters, the rivers and swamps betrayed them, their currents sluggish and laden with toxins that made each gulp of water a gamble with life itself. Dissolved oxygen in these aquatic refuges sank to dangerously low levels, often approaching near zero in localized pockets, leaving early bony fishes, amphibians, and small reptiles gasping under the water's weight. Invertebrates, including brachiopods and mollusks, struggled to filter what little oxygen remained. Their shells etched by the increasingly acidic waters, revealing microscopic pitting caused by the chemical assault of sulfuric and carbonic acids. Even freshwater algae, once a source of nourishment, decayed rapidly under thermal stress, producing clouds of carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide that further choked aquatic life. Massive temnospondyls, Predators that had once thrived in rich swamps now prowled tenuous oxygen pockets, muscles straining as they hunted in waters that changed from life-sustaining to lethal within hours. Small amphibians sought refuge among the roots of submerged Glossopteris or in shaded undercuts, relying on behavioral ingenuity to find microzones with higher oxygen concentrations. Fossil evidence suggests that some species migrated laterally along river channels in search of these narrow refuges, travelling kilometres over precarious substrate, their survival dependent on the rare combination of cooler temperatures and slightly elevated oxygen. Acidic plumes, born from volcanic runoff, etched shells and coral-like structures, weakening the protective armour of aquatic invertebrates. Brachiopods, such as spirifa and mollusks, including bivalves, found themselves trapped between the corrosive water and oxygen-depleted currents. Their slow movement and sessile habits, once evolutionary advantages, became liabilities, forcing species to adapt rapidly or face extinction. Even temporary calm waters offered no sanctuary, as chemical toxicity diffused through sediments and shifted unpredictably with currents and temperature fluctuations. Early ray-finned fishes, ancestors of modern teleosts, exhibited remarkable yet insufficient adaptations. Their gill surfaces expanded to capture minimal oxygen, while erratic swimming patterns allowed them to remain in the thinnest viable layers of water. Larger predators exploited moments when these fish faltered, creating a dynamic of opportunistic survival where even small gains in oxygen could determine life or death. Fossilized growth rings in fish bones suggest that metabolic stress stunted development, revealing the long-term physiological toll of hypoxic waters. Stratification created invisible traps beneath the surface. Denser, warmer water sank into oxygen-starved layers, while cooler surface currents fluctuated unpredictably, leaving mobile organisms constantly recalibrating their depth and position. Amphibians with dual respiratory systems, lungs and gills, shifted between layers to maximize intake, while insects and small arthropods utilized shallow, oxygenated films near the surface, illustrating how life exploited even the most marginal environmental gradients. Chemical gradients created unpredictable microhabitats within the seas, where pockets of cooler, oxygen-rich water coexisted with dense layers of CO2 and hydrogen sulfide. Some bivalves and brachiopods attempted vertical migration along the sediment-water interface, shifting centimeters at a time to remain in tolerable zones. Fossil isotopic analysis indicates these movements corresponded to rapid changes in water chemistry, revealing that survival depended not just on respiration, but on acute behavioral responsiveness to chemical stresses. Even smaller crustaceans altered feeding cycles, consuming detritus only during brief windows of improved oxygenation, demonstrating that life had to constantly adapt to ephemeral and lethal environmental mosaics. Algal blooms, fueled by nutrient runoff and chemical shifts, became lethal rather than beneficial. Their rapid decomposition consumed the remaining oxygen and released toxic gases that rose into pockets within shallow waters. Amphibians and small fishes faced simultaneous challenges: oxygen depletion from below and chemical toxicity from above. Invertebrates clung desperately to sediment surfaces, relying on slow filtration to survive brief windows of breathable water. These layers, ephemeral and unstable, demanded constant vigilance and movement. Dead zones expanded and contracted with the influence of thermal currents and ongoing volcanic activity. Fossil deposits from this period reveal layers of laminated sediment interspersed with collapsed shells and skeletons, evidence of mass die-offs in zones where chemical stress exceeded the tolerance of even the hardiest species. The interplay of temperature, acidity, and oxygen scarcity created a patchwork of survival, with life concentrated in narrow ribbons where conditions momentarily allowed respiration and feeding. Massive aquatic predators, including large temnospondyls, demonstrated remarkable behavioral plasticity. They exploited pockets of oxygen-rich water, hunting with frenzied precision, while avoiding areas where dissolved gases reached lethal concentrations. Fossilized jaw and limb morphology suggests adaptations for sudden bursts of movement, allowing them to navigate unstable currents and seize prey that faltered under hypoxia. These predators, while powerful, could not overcome the global scale of environmental collapse, illustrating the all-encompassing reach of the Permian's lethal oceans. Even submerged vegetation reflected the extreme conditions. Roots of Glossopteris and other semi-aquatic plants showed signs of stress, including tissue necrosis and slowed growth, as acidic waters disrupted nutrient uptake. Shallow waterways that had once nourished life became zones of stunted growth and decay, altering the base of the food web and compounding the challenges for herbivorous amphibians and small reptiles. The collapse of primary producers echoed upward through every trophic level, emphasizing that the struggle for survival in the Permian oceans was as much chemical and physiological as it was predatory. Predator-prey dynamics shifted in eerie new ways. Fish that had once relied on speed now depended on oxygen-rich patches to hunt or flee, and groups of amphibians clustered in ephemeral refuges became concentrated targets for predators. Fossil evidence suggests that selective mortality reshaped populations, favoring individuals with larger gill surface areas, slower metabolism, or tolerance to acidic water, while weaker or less adaptable species disappeared entirely. This relentless pressure created a living laboratory of evolution, one written in the bones and shells of survivors. Shadows of sunken trees, collapsed vegetation, and eroded riverbanks marked temporary refuges where life clung precariously to existence. Small pockets of oxygen-rich water persisted near inflows, shaded under overhanging banks, or among submerged root networks. Here, amphibians, insects, and juvenile fish concentrated, creating fragile communities that could persist only briefly before currents shifted, gases accumulated, or chemical composition changed once more. Every ripple and eddy told of the ocean's silent, unyielding dominance, a force as merciless as fire and suffocating air above, reminding all life that survival was an ongoing negotiation with a planet reshaped by catastrophe. The scorched earth, endless heat, and cracking deserts. Beyond the river's remnants, plains stretched in a shimmering haze, the sun bleaching every surface to a sterile brilliance. Heat waves radiated across parched soil, creating mirages that warped horizons and distorted distances, while creatures moved cautiously between dwindling pockets of shade. Fossil evidence from paleosols reveals temperature extremes exceeding 40–45 degrees Celsius in many regions, forcing amphibians and reptiles to adapt or perish. Water sources evaporated within days, leaving shallow puddles and mud cracks where oxygen and chemical balances fluctuated rapidly, providing only temporary relief to desperate organisms struggling under unrelenting thermal stress. Soils cracked in intricate, polygonal patterns, each fissure a testament to relentless evaporation and the absence of sustaining moisture. Analysis of late Permian paleosols shows desiccation fractures spanning tens of centimeters, sometimes over a meter in width, revealing prolonged droughts. Microbes and plant roots were disrupted, slowing nutrient cycling, while terrestrial arthropods sought refuge in deeper soil layers. Even small pools of water between cracks often became hypersaline or acidic, creating additional physiological challenges for amphibians and early reptiles, who relied on these ephemeral refuges for hydration and reproduction in the desertified landscape. Small amphibians and early reptiles scuttled between sparse pools, where water lingered long enough to permit brief feeding, reproduction, or respiration. Observed adaptations included burrowing behavior, nocturnal activity, and clustering in shaded depressions. Fossil trackways suggest these creatures traveled kilometers daily, navigating treacherous terrain to find viable water and food. Burrows and depressions acted as microclimates, where humidity remained slightly higher and temperatures were less lethal. However, these refuges were fragile and short-lived, as evaporation, heat, and predation constantly limited survival windows, forcing life into an unending cycle of desperate mobility and cautious endurance. Glossopterous forests, once dense and sheltering, now wilted beneath oppressive heat, their leaves curling and stems succumbing to desiccation. Stomatal density studies indicate reduced photosynthesis under thermal stress, while tree rings in preserved logs reveal slowed growth and drought-induced tissue necrosis. The collapse of forested regions not only deprived terrestrial animals of shade and food, but also contributed to soil erosion, further reducing water retention. Fallen leaves and decaying vegetation intensified fires in sun-exposed areas, creating a feedback loop of heat, combustion, and nutrient loss that reshaped the landscape into a hostile, fragmented mosaic of life and death. Thermally induced metabolic stress forced larger therapsids into nocturnal activity, avoiding the searing sun that could tip energy budgets toward collapse. Fossil bone microstructures indicate periods of slowed growth and physiological strain consistent with heat-induced dehydration. Predators adapted hunting strategies, taking advantage of weakened or disoriented prey in sparse environments. These behavioral shifts created intense competition over the few remaining water sources, while seasonal temperature spikes further reduced the survivable habitats. Nighttime became a brief window for mobility, foraging, and hunting, emphasizing that survival relied on a combination of timing, agility, and energy conservation under the relentless heat. Apex hunters' shadows lengthened across parched valleys, exploiting every weakened or trapped organism, as hunting strategies shifted to match the unforgiving landscape. Fossil evidence of bite marks and concentrated kill sites suggests opportunistic behavior intensified during drought peaks. Small reptiles and amphibians relied on speed, camouflage, and burrowed refuges to escape increasingly cunning hunters. Carnivorous therapsids demonstrated remarkable stamina and endurance, capable of tracking prey across desiccated plains for hours. Each interaction revealed the heightened mortality risk created by shrinking habitats, where every resource, water, shade, or prey, became a focal point for survival, driving evolutionary pressures to extremes. Intermittent dust storms rose from dried riverbeds, carrying fine particles that coated skin, gills, and respiratory surfaces, exacerbating physiological strain. Fossilized soil and sediment layers indicate storms could last days, with winds transporting mineral-rich dust across continents. Small amphibians, early reptiles, and arthropods were forced to retreat underground or into scarce vegetation, while exposed species faced suffocation, abrasion, and thermal shock. The storms also redistributed nutrients and organic matter, temporarily creating localized zones of fertility. Yet overall, they amplified mortality and stress, underscoring that environmental hazards were not limited to temperature alone, but included airborne chemical and particulate threats. Seeking shelter from harsh surface conditions, burrowing species attempted temporary escape, revealing fossil evidence of deep, ventilated tunnels that harbored isolated communities. Some small amphibians and insects relied on these subterranean refuges for shelter, moisture, and reduced predation. Analysis of burrow morphology suggests that some extend several meters, with branching networks to access oxygenated pockets. Yet underground life was not risk-free. Hypoxia, heat conduction, and limited food-constrained population size. Fossilized excrement within burrows indicates reliance on detritus and opportunistic feeding. These subterranean ecosystems illustrate a desperate adaptation strategy, allowing life to survive transiently while the surface environment became increasingly lethal. Nutrient cycling slowed dramatically as decayed vegetation and dead fauna accumulated under harsh conditions, altering soil microbiomes and affecting plant regrowth. Decomposition rates dropped due to heat stress and low moisture, leaving layers of organic matter that stifled seed germination. Insects and microbial communities were concentrated into microhabitats, creating competition for resources. Without regular rainfall, nitrogen and phosphorus availability declined, influencing plant community composition and further stressing herbivorous species. The feedback loop of desiccation, soil depletion, and vegetation collapse amplified environmental severity, demonstrating that survival was constrained not only by immediate heat and water stress, but also by systemic ecosystem destabilization. Heat-induced fire scars dotted the landscape, marking regions where spontaneous combustion and lightning strikes amplified ecological devastation. Fossil charcoal and burnt logs confirm repeated fire events across the Permian Plains. Fires destroyed remnant plant cover, increasing soil erosion and exposure, and forced animal migrations into already limited refuges. The combination of thermal extremes, drought, and frequent wildfires created a dynamic where animals and plants were continuously challenged to relocate, reproduce, or escape predation. Fire became an unpredictable yet powerful agent of mortality, shaping species distribution and reinforcing the narrative of an Earth reshaped by relentless environmental catastrophe. The horizon blurred under mirages and heat shimmer, emphasizing that survival required constant vigilance, mobility, and adaptation in a world relentlessly stripped of life-sustaining resources. Animals moved cautiously across barren plains, predators exploited every weakness, and ephemeral pools dictated daily routines. Fossil evidence suggests population collapses were widespread, with only small, adaptable species able to persist. Even in these extreme conditions, traces of life clung to microhabitats, hinting at resilience amidst chaos. The sun-baked landscape, endless and unyielding, stood as a testament to planetary forces exceeding the endurance of most species, while the stage was set for the next chapter of survival under an unforgiving Permian world. Predators of a broken world, giants stalking the weak. Across the cracked plains, shadows elongated as giants prowled, their movements deliberate and calculated. Muscles tensed beneath leathery skin, limbs designed for sudden acceleration and sustained pursuit, while eyes scanned for any sign of weakness in the few surviving herbivores and smaller reptiles. Fossilized trackways reveal precise ambush points near ephemeral waterholes and sparse vegetation, showing that predators exploited both terrain and environmental stress. Heat shimmer distorted distances, but these hunters adjusted instinctively, their sensory perception honed to the subtle movements of fatigued, dehydrated prey struggling across sun-scorched soils. Gigantic amphibians, some exceeding 3 meters in length, lurked near dwindling waterholes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Muscular tails propelled them with sudden bursts, while jaws lined with sharp, recurved teeth allowed them to seize and immobilize prey efficiently. Paleontological evidence suggests their metabolic systems tolerated heat stress better than smaller competitors, granting a strategic advantage in lethargic prey populations. These predators exploited weakened amphibians and small therapsids, transforming waterholes and shaded depressions into lethal traps, where life teetered on a knife edge dictated by both environmental extremes and evolutionary predatory efficiency. Therapsid hunters with robust jaws and serrated teeth roamed the scorched landscape in search of heat-stressed or injured prey. Gorgonopsians and Therocephalians, often exceeding 2 meters in length, relied on endurance and precision, capable of tracking prey across kilometers of arid terrain. Fossil bite marks reveal bone-crushing abilities, suggesting they could consume animals debilitated by dehydration or metabolic strain. Behavioral reconstructions indicate coordinated hunting patterns, where ambush and opportunism merged to exploit the smallest window of weakness, demonstrating that predation was as much an environmental adaptation as a biological imperative. Smaller animals huddled in the sparse shade of Glossopteris remnants or rock outcrops, acutely aware that weakness, injury, or hesitation could invite immediate death. Trackway fossils show repeated attempts to evade predators, with zigzagging paths and sudden dives into shallow depressions. Despite these evasive maneuvers, the combination of heat-induced lethargy, dehydration, and shrinking microhabitats made escape increasingly difficult. Physiological evidence from bone histology suggests chronic stress, with slowed growth rates and fatigue indicators across multiple species, reflecting the compounded pressures of extreme climate and the predatory dominance of larger apex species. Fossilized tracks indicate sudden charges and ambushes, revealing behavioral strategies honed for extreme scarcity and environmental stress. Predators exploited ephemeral streams and mudflats, using the sun's glare and shadows to mask their approach. Analysis of bite marks on limb and torso bones indicates rapid, forceful strikes designed to incapacitate quickly. Predation success was strongly correlated with environmental factors such as heat, substrate stability, and prey density. Even minor miscalculations by prey often proved fatal, emphasizing the ruthless efficiency with which these apex species capitalized on environmental degradation to maximize survival. Heat-induced lethargy in prey species made timing and patience essential for successful hunting, amplifying selective pressures on both predator and prey. Fossil evidence shows skeletal adaptations in prey, including reinforced limb bones and expanded gill or lung structures in amphibians, reflecting evolutionary responses to repeated stress. Predators tracked subtle physiological weaknesses, shallow breathing, slowed movements, irregular gait, demonstrating acute environmental awareness. These interactions created a high-stakes theatre of survival, where only those capable of acute sensory perception, rapid response, and adaptive flexibility could persist, revealing the intricate dance of life and death under Permian extremes. Predators adapted their hunting techniques to terrain, using dry riverbeds, sun-bleached ridges, and shadowed gullies to conceal movement until the last moment. Trackway analysis indicates deliberate spacing, coordinated pauses, and sudden bursts of speed, while tooth morphology reveals strategies for dismembering prey efficiently. Thermally stressed amphibians and reptiles were funneled into predictable paths, where predators could strike with minimal energy expenditure. This synergy of behavioral cunning and environmental exploitation underscores the evolutionary pressure on both hunters and hunted, demonstrating that survival was not only a matter of strength, but also of adaptability and intelligence. Competition between large amphibians and therapsids intensified as overlapping territories and limited prey forced confrontations. Fossil evidence suggests occasional combat between apex predators, with bite marks, healed fractures, and disarticulated skeletons revealing territorial disputes and resource competition. These interactions further constrained prey availability, creating cascading ecological effects that amplified mortality across multiple species. Behavioral adaptations included nocturnal hunting, strategic ambush points, and coordinated movements, reflecting a complex predator hierarchy that operated alongside environmental extremes, where dominance and survival were inseparable from the brutal logic of a collapsing ecosystem. Evidence from cranial morphology and bite marks demonstrates that these predators could crush bone, tear flesh, and exploit weakened organisms efficiently. Muscle attachment sites on skulls indicate remarkable bite force, while dental wear patterns suggest repetitive stress from large prey consumption. Even scavenging behaviors reflect opportunism, with apex predators consuming carcasses abandoned due to heat, dehydration, or predation. These strategies maximized caloric intake in a world where resources were unpredictable, illustrating that predation in the Permian was as much an exercise in survival economics as it was a display of raw power. Even in the shadow of apex predators, life persisted in microhabitats, but survival demanded constant vigilance, agility, and adaptation. Small amphibians, insects, and juvenile reptiles clustered in shaded depressions, burrows, and isolated vegetation, taking advantage of predator blind spots. Fossil evidence shows these microhabitats were critical refuges, sustaining population pockets that could regenerate when conditions temporarily improved. However, predation pressure was relentless, and mortality rates remained high, indicating that the hierarchy of life was dominated by those capable of enduring both environmental extremes and the strategic precision of giant hunters. Invisible threats, pathogens, fungi, and opportunistic microbes compounded mortality, ensuring that no escape from the Permian nightmare was absolute. Heat-stressed or injured animals became ideal hosts, while decaying carcasses accelerated the spread of bacteria and fungal spores. Fossilized lesions and microbial structures suggest disease was a pervasive force, subtly shaping population dynamics alongside predation and climate stress. The combination of visible and invisible threats rendered survival a constant negotiation where adaptation, timing, and resilience determined which species could persist. In this broken world, every shadow could conceal a predator or a lethal microbial threat, and even the fittest were never guaranteed safety. Plagues in the shadows, invisible killers beneath the surface. Along the dim margins of the dying landscape, microscopic forces stirred with unsettling vigor, exploiting wounds, weaknesses, and the stress etched into every living body. Heat-strained amphibians carried swollen lesions where opportunistic bacteria infiltrated thinning skin, while dry, cracked soils released aerosolized fungal spores capable of invading respiratory tissues. Geological studies of Permian paleosols reveal mineral films that once hosted dense microbial mats, suggesting explosive microbial proliferation during environmental collapse. As each fragile creature moved through shrinking refuges, Invisible threats intensified the hazard of every step, every breath, and every fleeting moment of survival. Under heaps of deteriorating foliage and contracting root beds, bacterial colonies proliferated within nutrient-heavy pockets left by mass die-offs, drawing energy from the proteins and lipids unlocked during decomposition. Chemical analysis of fossilized bone surfaces indicates microbial tunneling, where bacteria bored microscopic channels through weakened skeletons. These decay microbes thrived in temperatures exceeding 30 degrees Celsius, accelerating carcass breakdown and amplifying disease transmission. Carcasses that once decayed over weeks dissolved in days, turning refuge sites into microbial hotspots. Any animal lingering too long near the remnants of the dead risked inhaling or absorbing pathogens capable of undermining organs already strained by heat and starvation. Within the shallow layers of disturbed soils, actinomycete bacteria produced toxic secondary compounds that diffused through dust clouds whipped across barren plains. These soil-derived toxins, preserved as chemical biomarkers in Permian sediment cores, reveal environmental conditions that promoted bursts of antibiotic-like substances. While deadly to small invertebrates, these compounds irritated the mucous membranes of larger animals, inflaming airways already damaged by particulate matter and volcanic emissions. Each dust-laden gust carried its own arsenal of biological hazards, blurring the line between environmental stress and active microbial assault across the deteriorating Permian world. Inside still channels and contracting pools, protozoan parasites floated through sediment-laden water, infiltrating the gill tissues of fish debilitated by thermal stress and acidic conditions. Fossil traces of fused gill arches hint at chronic parasitic pressures that suffocated aquatic species struggling in oxygen-poor habitats. As shallow waters warmed beyond 32 degrees Celsius, protozoans reproduced rapidly, choking larvae and juveniles unable to escape deeper refuges. Even brief immersion in contaminated pools left amphibians vulnerable to systemic infections that spread through the bloodstream and organ systems. These unseen adversaries transformed every remaining water source into a lottery of survival. Throughout the withered ferns and thinning glossopterid forests, fungal pathogens infiltrated roots deprived of moisture, producing mycelial networks that spread through parched soils like silent fires. Paleobotanical evidence from coal-bearing Permian sequences shows patterns of root rot and necrosis consistent with aggressive fungal invasion. These infections disrupted water transport systems within plants, accelerating die-off across landscapes already crippled by dehydration. Herbivores that fed on infected tissues ingested spores capable of colonizing their digestive tracts, compounding malnutrition with internal fungal growth. Even the plant kingdom faced microbial opponents that thrived where stress undermined resistance. What were once considered safe havens, those burrows carved deep into the earth, turned into zones where anaerobic bacteria flourished in humid pockets formed by trapped moisture and decomposing food stores. These bacteria produced hydrogen, sulfide, and methane, gases capable of poisoning small reptiles or amphibians seeking refuge from surface heat. Microbial mats lining tunnel walls indicate persistent bacterial activity, preserved in trace fossil patterns resembling layered films. Animals, sheltering underground, inhaled toxins that weakened cardiovascular and respiratory systems, turning sanctuaries into death traps. Even the most strategic hiding places became compromised when microbial communities adapted to conditions shaped by prolonged environmental collapse. In floodplains intermittently soaked by toxic rainfall, algal blooms developed in shallow depressions, creating mats of cyanobacteria that released neurotoxins under intense sunlight. Biomarkers extracted from Permian lake sediments suggest repeated episodes of cyanobacterial expansion tied to nutrient influx from volcanic ash. Animals lapping from these green-stained puddles risked muscular paralysis, disorientation, and organ failure within hours. When winds dried these algal mats, flakes of toxic residue drifted across the surface, entering nasal passages and contaminating food sources. Even brief encounters with these microbial blooms carried life-threatening consequences. Hidden within decomposing logs and shaded detritus, parasitic nematodes utilized moist microhabitats to complete life cycles, accelerated by fluctuating humidity. Fossilized coprolites containing dissolved nematode eggs reveal infestations that likely caused anemia and internal bleeding in herbivorous therapsids. These parasites exploited hosts, weakened by heat stress, dehydration, and malnutrition, siphoning nutrients already in short supply. Infested animals displayed stunted growth and brittle bone microstructures documented in fossil remains, indicating systemic strain. The smallest parasites wielded disproportionate influence, reshaping the life histories of creatures already living on the brink. Slender riparian corridors shrank as biofilm-forming bacteria coated submerged stones and decaying roots, producing slippery, mucilaginous layers that trapped sediments rich in volatile organic compounds. These microbial films generated localized pockets of hypoxia, documented in geochemical gradients, and fossilized microbial textures, preserved in ancient channel deposits. Small aquatic organisms caught in these zones endured suffocation or poisoning as bacterial respiration consumed available oxygen. Fish navigating these treacherous currents confronted unseen barriers where microbial metabolism outpaced environmental renewal. Each film represented a tiny ecosystem engineered by microbes thriving amid ecological breakdown. Above the fractured terrain, airborne spores drifted through superheated winds, traveling dozens of kilometers before settling onto exposed skin, plant surfaces, or desiccated soil. Microscopic abrasion marks on fossil bones imply repeated irritation and infection from windborne particulates filled with fungal and bacterial elements. These spores germinated quickly upon contact with residual moisture, infiltrating tissues or initiating rot in weakened vegetation. Even robust therapsids suffered recurring infections as spores invaded nasal passages and inflamed the respiratory linings. The air itself became a delivery system for pathogens adapted to harsh climatic extremes. Beyond the reach of sight or sound, microbial networks cooperated, competed, and evolved with astonishing speed, turning environmental collapse into a laboratory for biological innovation. Pathogens diversified as rapidly as their hosts declined, producing new strains capable of bypassing immune defenses eroded by continuous stress. Fossil evidence of bone deformities, lesions, and mineralized microbial colonies demonstrates how disease sculpted Permian ecosystems alongside climate and predation. As these silent plagues spread, they ensured that no refuge remained untouched. Even before volcanic fire reshaped the horizon, unseen killers had already rewritten the fate of countless species. Skies of flame, wildfires and acid rains devouring life. As invisible killers retreated into shadows, the horizon erupted with a new, unmistakable fury, igniting forests, grasslands, and marshes alike. Volcanic heat, parched soils, and lightning strikes converged to spark uncontrolled wildfires that roared across the continents. Ash and smoke rose into the stratosphere, darkening skies and scattering sunlight in hazy veils. Trees, ferns, and glossopterid stands were quickly consumed, leaving behind blackened skeletons of trunks and leaves. Every inhalation carried smoke-laden particulates. Each gust spread fire embers farther, and the air pulsed with the unrelenting heat of a world scorched from pole to equator. Smoke plumes thickened into rolling columns, mingling with sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide from volcanic eruptions, forming acidic clouds capable of burning delicate leaf surfaces and corroding exposed soil. Sediment cores from the Permian reveal layers of chemically altered deposits, indicating repeated cycles of acid precipitation interspersed with periods of wildfire dormancy. Rainfall, when it came, was corrosive rather than replenishing, stripping essential minerals from vegetation and accelerating plant mortality. Animals exposed to these downpours suffered damaged skin, mucus irritation, and disrupted metabolic processes, while smaller amphibians and insects were often killed outright before they could seek shelter. Charcoal fragments embedded in floodplain sediments tell of a world repeatedly scorched, where fire left permanent traces in the geologic record. Glossopterid forests, once dominant, show evidence of complete canopy loss, while understory ferns and horsetails perished under intense heat. Fossilized soil horizons display oxidized iron and potassium enrichment, signaling both combustion and ash deposition. Fire not only consumed biomass, but also altered nutrient cycles, leaving soils temporarily infertile and forcing surviving herbivores to seek scarce, unburned vegetation. The destructive power of fire intersected with chemical assaults from acid, compounding environmental stress across every ecosystem. Volcanically induced wildfires ignited litter and leaf debris across parched floodplains, while wind carried embers kilometers ahead, creating spot fires that devastated isolated refuges. Fossil evidence from Permian strata shows successive burn layers in the same locales, suggesting repeated infernos within a humanly unimaginable time span. These recurrent fires eliminated temporary shelters for small reptiles and amphibians, forcing constant movement under suffocating heat and ash. The combination of fire and acid rain transformed once fertile floodplains into lethal corridors, where survival depended on rapid relocation, endurance, and a precarious balance between risk and opportunity. Acidic precipitation attacked every living tissue it contacted, stripping waxy coatings from plant leaves and altering soil pH to levels hostile to root growth. Chemical analyses indicate that sulfuric and nitric acid concentrations reach thresholds capable of killing seedlings and destabilizing established root systems. Herbivores feeding on these compromised plants ingested residues that disrupted digestion and mineral absorption, compounding malnutrition already caused by habitat loss. As ash settled atop scorched soils, it interacted with rainfall to form corrosive muds, poisoning aquatic microhabitats and transforming ephemeral streams into zones of lethal chemical concentration for fish and amphibians. Animal behavior shifted dramatically under constant threat. Therapsids, amphibians, and insects adopted nocturnal or burrowing routines to evade flame and heat. Fossilized trackways show repeated detours around burned zones, implying awareness of fire progression and selective avoidance. Shelters in damp soil or shaded debris were often temporary reprieves, as acid rains penetrated burrow entrances and compromised air quality. Even aerial predators faced hazards, with reduced visibility from smoke layers hampering hunting efficiency. Every movement carried the potential for injury or death, turning the pursuit of food, water, and refuge into an unceasing gamble in a world dominated by combustion and chemical assault. Ash deposits blanketed marshes, ponds, and riverbanks, choking emergent life and covering aquatic plants with fine layers of particulate matter. fish gills clogged under suspended ash, while invertebrates succumbed to combined hypoxia and chemical irritation. Fossilized sediment laminations reveal abrupt die-offs, coinciding with major wildfire events, suggesting rapid ecosystem collapse. Decomposing plant matter under heat and acidity accelerated the release of nutrients and toxins into water bodies, creating short-lived pulses of microbial activity that further stressed surviving aquatic life. Streams and ponds became unpredictable traps, where oxygen deficits and toxicity combined to turn every refuge into a potential death zone. Sediment chemistry indicates spikes in sulfur isotopes, tracing the long-distance transport of volcanic emissions and the global reach of acid rain events. Studies of coal-forming basins suggest that repeated fires contributed to increased carbon release, intensifying greenhouse conditions that exacerbated heat waves. Evidence of scorched tree rings and ash-laden leaf impressions confirms that repeated cycles of fire and precipitation were widespread. Animals forced to forage in these destabilized environments experienced chronic stress, slowed growth, and reduced reproductive success, leaving populations vulnerable to additional pressures from predators, disease, and ongoing habitat destruction. Even resilient species displayed clear physiological impacts, with fossilized bone microstructures revealing reduced growth rates, malnutrition, and stress markers consistent with repeated exposure to heat, smoke, and chemical hazards. Isotopic analysis of tooth enamel suggests fluctuating water availability and mineral imbalance, reflecting the combined pressures of burned vegetation and acidified streams. Amphibians and small reptiles frequently died in shallow depressions, while larger therapsids exhibited intermittent lethargy or displacement due to compromised resources. The synergy of flame, acid, and particulate matter created a relentless triad of mortality, where adaptations alone could only partially mitigate environmental assault. Landscapes, stripped of canopy and understory, became canvases for fire-adapted fungi and opportunistic microbes, which colonized ash-laden soils, feeding on charred organic matter and altering nutrient availability for the next generation of plants. Biomarkers extracted from Permian sediments indicate that these microbial blooms released additional gases, further acidifying localized precipitation and amplifying soil toxicity. Burrowing and nocturnal activity offered temporary protection, yet spores and toxins penetrated most refuges. Ecosystem collapse progressed in waves, with visible destruction above ground mirrored by chemical and microbial devastation below. Ensuring that survival required more than mobility, it demanded timing, resilience, and adaptation to rapidly shifting hazards. From scorched plains to burned river valleys, the interplay of flame, acid, and smoke sculpted the Permian landscape, leaving an enduring record in charcoal, ash, and isotopic signatures. Trees, ferns, amphibians, and therapsids all faced simultaneous assaults from heat, chemical injury, and resource loss. Fossil evidence reveals cycles of devastation punctuated by brief recovery, yet the relentless combination of fire and acidic precipitation reshaped ecosystems faster than life could fully adapt. As the planet's atmosphere darkened with smoke and chemical fallout, surviving species were forced into new strategies for defense, mobility, and endurance, confronting the next phase of an unrelenting nightmare. Venom and spines, evolution's deadly arms race. Charred horizons no longer only threatened life, they revealed the selective pressure shaping the next wave of defenses. The Permian world, already ravaged by fire, acid, and suffocating air, became an arena where even minor adaptations determined survival. Fossil evidence shows that species able to modify morphology, rapidly developing sharp spines, reinforced shells, or venomous bites, were disproportionately represented in the dwindling populations, while the less adaptable perished. Evolution accelerated under these conditions, producing creatures whose bodies told a story of necessity. Every bone, scale, and gland a testament to the relentless arms race between predator and prey. Leaves hardened into spiny barricades, deterring herbivores and rewriting survival strategies in harsh Permian climates. Ferns, seed ferns, and early gymnosperms produced sharp projections along stems and leaf margins, while cuticle thickness increased to resist both herbivory and chemical injury from acidic precipitation. These structural adaptations were not merely defensive, they reshaped the interactions of entire ecosystems. Fossilized leaves show notches and bite marks precisely countered by the development of new spines or tougher tissue, revealing an iterative dance between flora and the creatures that sought to consume them. A silent war written into the fossil record. Specialized glands secreted potent toxins, transforming seemingly harmless creatures into living hazards for predators and prey alike. Early amphibians, therapsids, and small synapsids developed chemical deterrents in saliva, glands, or skin, providing a lethal response to attacks and reducing mortality. Analyses of fossilized bones indicate bite marks that correspond to these defensive adaptations, suggesting predators learned to avoid certain prey over time. The chemical arms race extended beyond the obvious, influencing feeding behaviors, social interactions, and even mating strategies, creating a complex web of survival strategies encoded in anatomy, chemistry, and instinct. Claws flexed, and tails whipped with lethal precision, enabling both offense and rapid escape under relentless heat. Fossils of gorgonopsids and large temnospondyls show reinforced limb bones and muscular attachment points consistent with predatory specialization, while tails often exhibit evidence of ossified spines or dermal ridges used for defense. Such anatomical modifications enhanced hunting efficiency, allowing predators to target weakened or isolated prey, while simultaneously providing a deterrent to competitors. Every strike, swipe, or stab was honed by natural selection, and the fossil record preserves the subtle interplay of offensive and defensive engineering in real time, sculpted by the unforgiving Permian environment. Chemical warfare extended beneath the canopy, as plants infused soil and water with compounds that disrupted animal physiology. Allelopathic chemicals altered nutrient cycles and inhibited germination or digestion, creating invisible boundaries that shaped population distribution. These compounds also entered aquatic environments, influencing herbivorous fish, amphibians, and invertebrates, leaving detectable traces in sedimentary layers. Such interactions indicate that survival was increasingly dictated by indirect pressures. Creatures had to navigate a landscape where food was scarce, toxicity pervasive, and even microhabitats could pose mortal risk, forcing adaptations in physiology, behavior, and diet simultaneously across multiple ecosystems. Fossils expose a narrative of skeletal innovation, where bone density, spines, and ridges trace evolutionary battles. Armored fish, heavily ossified amphibians, and synapsids develop structural defenses to withstand predation, while defensive ridges in cranial bones suggest impacts from bites or thrashing prey. Paleohistological studies confirm accelerated bone growth during these periods, indicating a rapid response to environmental and predatory stress. The record shows that the Permian arms race was not incremental. It was an explosive burst of adaptation across multiple lineages, with evolutionary pressure magnified by simultaneous ecological catastrophes, leaving the most resilient and responsive species in the gene pool. Murky rivers and stagnant swamps hosted armored fish and venomous amphibians, each adaptation responding to lurking threats. Freshwater ecosystems became crucibles of selective pressure. Gill morphology, dermal plating, and venomous spines increase survival odds in oxygen-poor, predator-filled waters. Fossil assemblages reveal concentrated populations in isolated refugia, where interactions between prey and predator accelerated evolutionary innovation. Behavioral adaptations, such as ambush, predation, schooling, and burrowing, complemented physical defenses, demonstrating that survival was as much about strategy as anatomy. Each species' morphology reflects both its immediate environment and the predation pressures exerted by other evolving organisms. Sensory organs sharpened alongside physical defenses, allowing creatures to anticipate danger and react with lethal efficiency. Enhanced olfactory bulbs, visual acuity, and auditory structures appear in cranial fossils, suggesting heightened awareness in both predators and prey. Such adaptations were critical in a landscape of extreme environmental stress. Limited cover, scorching heat, and widespread fire meant that early detection often determined life or death. Coupled with venom, claws, or spines, these sensory refinements allowed predators to exploit vulnerabilities while prey species developed evasive behaviors, demonstrating the tight co-evolutionary feedback loop of Permian ecosystems. Evidence preserved in coprolites, gnawed bones, and tooth scars uncovers the real-time consequences of these evolutionary arms races. Traces of venom injection, defensive bites, and claw marks illustrate predator-prey interactions under extreme ecological pressure. Comparative studies of fossilized gut contents reveal shifts in diet corresponding to defensive adaptations, while skeletal injuries indicate both failed attacks and successful defenses. These records illuminate a dynamic, iterative process of adaptation, demonstrating how environmental stresses, predation, and competition combined to accelerate morphological and behavioral evolution simultaneously across multiple lineages. Every sharpened spine and venomous fang testified to the relentless ingenuity required to survive in a world under siege. Even the smallest morphological change could alter survival odds in the Permian nightmare. Combined with chemical, behavioral, and sensory adaptations, these evolutionary responses illustrate a planet in constant flux, where fire, acid, heat, and predation exerted unparalleled selective pressure. Life adapted not only to survive catastrophes, but to exploit the gaps they left, demonstrating resilience, creativity, and the sheer power of evolutionary innovation in a world stripped to its raw, merciless essence. In this crucible of extreme conditions, the arms race between predator and prey did not pause. It intensified, driving life toward greater specialization and lethal precision. Organisms capable of combining physical defenses, venom, and heightened senses gained reprieve, yet environmental pressures continued to mount. The interplay between adaptation and catastrophe highlights how necessity forged extraordinary biological innovations, while also foreshadowing the next phase of the Permian nightmare, where even water, soil, and the skies themselves would conspire to challenge the persistence of life in unprecedented ways. Ambush in the shallows, rivers and swamps as death traps. Submerged shadows shifted with deadly intent, revealing the predator's patient calculation beneath the water's surface. Murky currents concealed massive temnospondyls and amphibious fish, their eyes and lateral lines finely tuned to detect even the faintest ripple. In these shallow rivers and swamp pools, predators exploited the confusion of sediment-laden waters, waiting for prey weakened by heat, hypoxia, or scarcity of food. Fossil evidence shows bite marks consistent with rapid strikes, while preserved jaw morphology indicates adaptations for sudden, ambush-style predation. Every lurking predator transformed a seemingly calm waterway into a lethal gauntlet, turning survival into an exercise of constant vigilance. Murky currents concealed both threat and opportunity, creating microhabitats that tested the adaptability of every aquatic organism. Pools fed by irregular rivers became both refuge and trap. Small amphibians, fish, and invertebrates concentrated in oxygen-rich pockets, unknowingly drawing predators to predictable locations. Sedimentary layers reveal how these shallow refuges often became densely packed ecosystems, with death and survival intertwined. Temperature gradients, oxygen depletion, and periodic flooding combined to accelerate natural selection, as only the swift, vigilant, or chemically adapted could endure. In this world, every microhabitat represented both a sanctuary and an ambush site. Teeth, jaws, and armored scales evolved in tandem, each modification a response to the high stakes of predation in oxygen-starved pools. Armored fish developed reinforced plates to resist snapping jaws, while amphibians like Eriops displayed strong cranial bones capable of delivering crushing bites. Fossil analysis shows that jaw mechanics allowed for rapid opening and closing, enabling predators to strike with lethal precision in murky, turbulent waters. Similarly, prey species modified defensive spines and body postures to counter these threats. The aquatic arms race mirrored terrestrial innovations, with each adaptation directly influencing survival rates in a landscape dominated by chemical and predatory pressures. In shallow marshes, lethargic prey were ensnared not only by predators, but by the water's chemical and thermal extremes. Oxygen levels dropped unpredictably as heat intensified and decomposition accelerated, forcing fish and amphibians into restricted layers where predators patrolled. Acidic runoff from burned soils further stressed these populations, altering gill function and digestive efficiency. Fossilized plant debris, in conjunction with sediment layers, reveals how these environmental pressures funneled prey into lethal corridors, demonstrating that survival in Permian waters required not only speed and vigilance, but also physiological resilience to chemical stresses. Fossilized bite marks and gut contents illuminate patterns of ambush predation, providing a window into the Permian underwater arms race. Coprolites from temnospondyls and fish indicate not only prey selection, but also repeated predatory strategies. Rapid strikes, targeting weakened individuals, and exploiting oxygen-poor refuges. Detailed analysis of cranial and jaw fossils reveals bite force estimates, suggesting that predators could immobilize prey with a single, well-placed strike. This evidence underscores that ambush in the shallows was not random. It was a calculated, evolutionary dance shaped by extreme environmental conditions and the relentless push of natural selection. Branching river networks acted as both refuges and traps, directing currents and concentrating prey in predictable zones. Seasonal flooding expanded temporary channels, only to recede and leave isolated pools teeming with desperate life. Predators quickly adapted, learning to patrol these confined spaces efficiently. Sedimentology demonstrates how fluctuating water levels created high-density habitats that intensified predator-prey encounters. Even minor variations in flow or depth dictated which species survived long enough to reproduce, amplifying evolutionary pressures. and sculpting a selective landscape where life and death were determined in mere moments of hydrological and biological precision. Sensory adaptations from lateral line enhancements to olfactory sophistication allowed predators to detect subtle disturbances in the water. Fossilized cranial features reveal expanded sensory structures, while comparative studies suggest that these enhancements improved strike accuracy in turbid waters. Prey species countered with camouflage, sudden bursts of speed, or evasive schooling behaviors, demonstrating a reciprocal evolutionary pressure. The interplay between acute detection and environmental opacity illustrates that survival was as much a product of neural and sensory innovation as of physical morphology, a reflection of how extreme conditions favored multi-layered adaptations across the aquatic ecosystem. Competition among predators intensified in confined aquatic spaces, triggering rapid morphological innovation observable in fossil assemblages. Juvenile amphibians, small synapsids, and fish were subject not only to adult predators, but also to intraspecific competition, leading to accelerated growth rates and reinforced defensive features. Trace fossils, including scratch marks and damaged exoskeletons, indicate both violent interactions and predation attempts, highlighting a brutal hierarchy. Evolutionary pressure operated on multiple scales, as predators not only competed for prey, but also for territory, resulting in rapid diversification of hunting strategies, body size, and sensory acuity under extreme Permian stress. Environmental hazards compounded the danger. Hypoxic water, acidic runoff, and fluctuating temperatures turned ordinary pools into lethal arenas. Oxygen depletion limited mobility and endurance, while acidic conditions damaged gills and cuticles, weakening prey before a predator struck. Temperature extremes caused thermal stress, slowing metabolism and reaction times, effectively amplifying predatory efficiency. Sedimentary and chemical analyses reveal repeated episodes of mass mortality in shallow pools, underscoring how the physical environment amplified biological threats. Life in these waters required not just adaptation to predation, but mastery of chemical and thermal extremes simultaneously. Each calculated strike, lunge, and escape revealed the fine-tuned balance between predatory strategy and survival instincts, echoing the unrelenting pressure of the Permian nightmare. Fossils indicate that even minor physical modifications, teeth curvature, scale thickness, or tail musculature could determine survival odds. Behavioral adaptations, such as burrowing, hiding beneath debris, or exploiting shaded microhabitats, complemented morphological defenses. The shallow waters were a crucible of selective pressure, where the interplay of predator, prey, and environment accelerated evolutionary innovation, revealing that survival was a constant negotiation with both visible and invisible forces, shaping the fate of every organism. Tangled rivers and swamps harbored life, clinging precariously to existence, each movement potentially fatal. Pools teemed with species, forced to adapt simultaneously to hypoxia, predators, and chemical stress, demonstrating the intense interconnectedness of environmental and biological pressures. Evolutionary innovations in these aquatic habitats foreshadowed the next challenges on land, as floods, storms, and predator-prey interactions would continue to push adaptation to extremes. The Permian nightmare did not relent for those seeking refuge in water. Survival demanded agility, sensory acuteness, and physiological resilience, ensuring that even aquatic sanctuaries became arenas of relentless danger. Tempests of terror, storms and floods sweeping across the Permian, thunderheads coalesced above parched plains, casting shadows that foreshadowed a deluge unlike any seen in recent memory. The sky, once a muted canvas of heat and dust, darkened with swollen clouds that churned in violent anticipation. Atmospheric pressure shifts triggered sudden gusts, bending ferns and snapping brittle branches, while lightning illuminated distant mountains in jagged, ephemeral arcs. Beneath this brewing tempest, small pools and rivulets swelled rapidly, carrying the remnants of fragile habitats downstream. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that such storms were not seasonal aberrations, but recurring cataclysms that punctuated the Permian nightmare. Floodwaters tore through valleys and lowlands with unrelenting force, uprooting plants, dislodging soil, and inundating areas that had offered fleeting respite. Logs, silt, and carcasses collided in chaotic torrents, leaving behind sedimentary layers that modern geology reads as markers of extreme hydrological events. Amphibians, juvenile fish, and insects were swept from one channel to another, surviving by chance alone, while less fortunate organisms were lost forever in muddy, oxygen-depleted currents. Fossilized trackways indicate that terrestrial species attempted desperate movements toward elevated ground, often arriving too late to escape the surge. Tree trunks, fallen limbs, and detritus collided in swirling waters, creating temporary whirlpools that served as both traps and transport for displaced life. The hydrodynamics of these flash floods reshaped river courses, deposited layers of sand and clay, and created microhabitats that were short-lived but ecologically significant. Isotopic analyses of Permian sedimentary sequences reveal repeated spikes in deposition, consistent with extreme rainfall events, corroborating the dramatic impact of storms on both landforms and life. Each flood, though transient, amplified the selective pressures already imposed by fire, hypoxia, and predation, reshaping survival strategies in a matter of hours. Organisms clung to elevated banks, exposed roots, or hidden hollows, testing endurance against currents that could topple or drown with little warning. Fossil evidence from shallow aquatic sites demonstrates that amphibians and small reptiles often survived by gripping submerged vegetation, while others were forced into novel dispersal patterns, colonizing distant pools created by storm-driven erosion. This forced mobility not only influenced population dynamics, but also accelerated evolutionary pressures, favoring traits that allowed rapid response to hydrological extremes. High-velocity winds accompanied the rains, bending fragile ferns, snapping weaker branches, and stripping leaves from canopy-forming plants. The combination of mechanical damage and water stress led to cascading ecological consequences, reducing food availability for herbivores and altering the structure of sheltering vegetation. Invertebrates, insects, and juvenile vertebrates were forced to navigate constantly changing terrain where safety was fleeting and vulnerability universal. Even relatively sturdy species faced repeated exposure to environmental stressors, which over time contributed to population decline and localized extinctions. Amphibians, fish, and small reptiles were displaced into unfamiliar channels, demonstrating both the lethal and dispersal effects of storm events. Fossil assemblages suggest that some species were carried kilometers from their usual habitats, either to perish in unsuitable environments or to establish new refuges. Sedimentological evidence indicates that floodwaters deposited nutrient-rich layers, creating temporary ecological opportunities for surviving species, but only for a short period before subsequent storms or chemical stressors erased them. This cyclical destruction and brief renewal underscored the Permian world as one of constant instability. Predators, ever attuned to vulnerability, exploited the chaos. Crocodiliform ancestors, large amphibians, and opportunistic therapsids struck at disoriented prey, their hunting patterns amplified by the disarray of flood-driven landscapes. Mortality rates spiked, not only from drowning or starvation, but also from predation, intensified by environmental collapse. Fossilized remains demonstrate that individuals caught mid-flood were often partially consumed, highlighting the interplay of abiotic and biotic threats during extreme weather events. Survival required both instinctive response and physical resilience, yet even the fittest faced overwhelming odds. Microbial communities responded with astonishing speed to storm-driven nutrient influxes, forming ephemeral blooms in pools and sediments enriched by decaying organic matter. These blooms, while providing temporary food for some organisms, also altered oxygen levels, pH, and chemical composition in ways that could be lethal to other species. The combination of storm-induced mechanical stress and subsequent microbial shifts created a complex ecological feedback loop, intensifying the harshness of life in the Permian and demonstrating how biological and geological systems were tightly interwoven. As waters receded and the horizon cleared, the landscape bore a chaotic, transformed imprint. Sediment-laden riverbeds, stripped vegetation, and fragmented habitats served as stark evidence of the storm's power. Temporary pools and sheltered hollows became oases for surviving life. Yet they offered only partial protection against the multitude of ongoing threats: fire, drought, predators, and pathogens. Each flood left an indelible mark on survival strategies, forcing adaptations that balanced mobility, endurance, and opportunistic behavior in a world governed by extremes. Ultimately, these tempests revealed the Permian Earth as a crucible of relentless pressure, where atmospheric violence collided with predation, disease, and environmental collapse to test the limits of life. The convergence of forces, storm, flood, fire, and chemical stress ensured that no refuge was absolute, that survival demanded ingenuity and resilience, and that the stage was perpetually set for the next catastrophe. Life persisted only by negotiating each new hazard, with each storm reinforcing the brutal reality that the planet itself was both sculptor and executioner, preparing the final acts of the Permian nightmare. The Great Dying, when fire, poison, and famine converged, the sun rose behind a sky choked with ash, casting a muted, sickly light across a world on the brink of annihilation. Volcanic emissions from the Siberian traps mingled with chemical clouds, producing an atmosphere thick with carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulates that alternately blocked warmth and amplified it, creating a climate far beyond the tolerance of nearly all life. Forests, once dense and teeming with amphibians, insects, and towering gymnosperms, smoldered in chemical-laden firestorms, while rivers and lakes became toxic mirrors reflecting a sky heavy with the stench of decay and sulfur. The very air pressed on the lungs of every breathing creature, each inhalation a labor, each movement a negotiation with the relentless environment. Torrents of poisonous rain scoured valleys, leaching essential minerals, burning leaves and soft tissues, and acidifying soils in an unprecedented assault on terrestrial ecosystems. Ferns, seed ferns, and conifers, unable to detoxify rapidly, collapsed in waves, their decay feeding microbial blooms that further stressed the remaining fauna. Vertebrates, from giant therapsids to small insectivorous reptiles, faced a dual crisis: dwindling food supplies and an atmosphere that compromised respiration. Even burrows and temporary shelters offered scant protection, as soil and water carried lethal compounds directly into the habitats of those clinging to survival. Evidence from petrified soils shows alternating layers of ash and chemical deposits, documenting repeated pulses of environmental stress that left no sanctuary intact. Fractured soils became arenas for microbial activity, consuming decaying organic matter in chemical infernos of decomposition and gas release. Oxygen levels plummeted in shallow rivers and wetlands, leaving creatures gasping in hypoxic pockets. Trace fossils indicate that amphibians congregated in the last oxygen-rich microhabitats, only to be swept away by sudden shifts in water chemistry or heat spikes. Insects and small arthropods displayed temporary population spikes in these refugia, exploiting niches too ephemeral for larger organisms to survive. Mineralized microbial mats, preserved in sedimentary layers, demonstrate the astonishing scale of life adapting in microhabitats, even as the wider world fell into collapse. Hunger drove predators to roam, yet no prey remained as famine claimed weakened populations. Giant amphibians that had once dominated swamps and rivers starved, while therapsids and small carnivorous reptiles encountered empty plains. Their hunting grounds turned to desolate expanses. Fossilized burrows and trackways revealed desperate migration attempts in search of scarce resources, yet the planet offered no real sanctuary. Each step became a gamble with mortality, as the convergence of fire, poison, famine, and suffocation rendered even the most agile and resilient creatures vulnerable. The extinction pulse was global, sparing only the smallest, most adaptable, or deeply sheltered species. Oceans, boiling and oxygen depleted, expelled the last gasping fish into turbulent currents. Phytoplankton and cyanobacteria, driven by nutrient overload from terrestrial die-offs, bloomed excessively, consuming remaining oxygen and creating vast marine dead zones. Shellfish, trilobite remnants, and early mollusks succumbed to rapid acidification, their calcium carbonate exoskeletons dissolving in waters increasingly hostile. Apex marine predators, including large bony fish and early cephalopods, dwindled under combined pressures, leaving behind sediment layers rich in chemical anomalies but devoid of large vertebrate fossils. Geochemical markers of carbon and sulfur isotopes confirm this global die-off, recording the severity of the Permian oceanic collapse. Clinging to minuscule, scattered puddles, amphibian colonies succumbed to relentless heat and desiccation. Soil cracking and evaporative loss reduced moisture to near zero, leaving the remaining organisms dependent on ephemeral water sources. Fossilized footprints document frantic movement toward marginal habitats, yet fire, toxic runoff, and predation ensured few individuals survived long enough to reproduce. Plant life was reduced to sparse, stress-tolerant forms, each struggling to photosynthesize beneath haze-darkened skies. While pollen and spore records reveal abrupt declines in diversity and reproductive success, even the smallest vegetative patches carried the imprint of extinction pressures, showing the global scale of environmental stress. Volcanic emissions mingled with storm surges, creating clouds of acidic vapor that swept inland with hurricane-force winds. These storms accelerated the destruction of fragile microhabitats, stripping vegetation from riverbanks, scouring soils, and depositing thick layers of mineralized ash across plains and lowlands. Geological evidence demonstrates repeated pulses of lava and chemical precipitation, preventing ecosystems from recovering between catastrophes. Each successive pulse compounded mortality, leaving a planet increasingly inhospitable to complex life. Charcoalized tree trunks and preserved plant imprints reveal that firestorms and acid rain often coincided, amplifying the lethality of environmental collapse. In the stratified deposits of continents, staggering mortality is recorded, each layer a testament to ecological collapse. Fossil assemblages show abrupt turnover in species composition, extinction of dominant lineages, and survival of only the most adaptable or micro-habitat-dependent organisms. Isotopic anomalies in carbon, sulfur, and oxygen ratios corroborate the extreme environmental shifts, documenting life struggling against a multi-front crisis of heat, poison, suffocation, and starvation. Fossilized burrows and sedimentary trace fossils reveal isolated survival events, hinting at the faint persistence of life even amid near total collapse. Rare species persisted in marginal refuges, their survival precarious and temporary. Small insects, burrowing reptiles, and extremophile plants occupied isolated niches where heat, chemical toxicity, and predation were mitigated just enough to allow reproduction. Yet these refuges were fragile, scattered, and incapable of sustaining large populations or rebuilding lost ecological networks. Fossil evidence suggests these survivors seeded the eventual recovery in the Triassic, but only after hundreds of thousands of years would ecosystems regain any semblance of complexity. Microbial mats and cyanobacterial colonies in fossil sediments indicate that even simple life persisted, laying the groundwork for ecological rebirth. The final echoes of the Permian world fading left fragments of life behind, silent witnesses to a global apocalypse. The convergence of fire, poison, famine, and hypoxia annihilated more than 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. Charred soils, desiccated riverbeds, and chemical-laden sediments stand as enduring records of a planet transformed by catastrophe. Even the few surviving species bore scars of extreme environmental stress, including bone deformities, stunted growth, and reduced reproductive success. In this ultimate crucible, life's persistence became a testament to resilience under conditions beyond imagination, foreshadowing evolutionary innovations that would arise from the shadows of total devastation. Echoes of terror, the silent world after the nightmare. A hollow wind whispered across lands where towering forests once captured sunlight. Now, skeletal remains of trees reached like desperate hands toward a dim, ash-streaked sky, their branches brittle from fire and chemical corrosion. Rivers, once bustling with fish and amphibians, had dwindled to trickles or evaporated entirely, leaving mineral-stained beds. Shadows of past life clung to every surface, faint and fragile. The scale of devastation revealed not only the immediate brutality of fire, poison, and famine, but also the long-lasting imprint of environmental stress on ecosystems, foreshadowing a world teetering on the brink of total silence. Sediment-laden pools, reflected skies tainted with ash and chemical residue, signaling lifeless waters. Tiny microbial mats, resilient and adaptive, clung to the edges of these stagnant pools, creating the first faint echoes of biological continuity. Amphibians that had survived the great floods now congregated in microhabitats, struggling to extract oxygen from the tainted water. Trace fossils indicate sporadic predation among these survivors, though numbers were infinitesimal compared to pre-catastrophe populations. Each ripple in the pools became a study in survival, a testament to life eking out existence in chemical landscapes reshaped by volcanic ash, acidification, and oxygen depletion. Resilient microbial communities thrived in fractured soils, orchestrating the first slow cycles of regeneration. Fungi and bacteria formed symbiotic networks that began breaking down charred plant matter, gradually releasing nutrients back into soils stripped of fertility. Root systems of surviving plants exploited these pockets of enriched sediment, setting the stage for incremental recolonization. Fossilized spores suggest that some microbial lineages had undergone genetic adaptations to survive extreme heat, low moisture, and elevated chemical toxicity. These underground ecosystems, invisible to most observers, were silently stabilizing landscapes, offering a blueprint for the recovery of life in a post-apocalyptic Permian world. Twisted trunks and scorched ferns marked the remnants of ecosystems that could not endure. Charcoal deposits, preserved in sedimentary layers, reveal repeated cycles of wildfires, some ignited by lightning, others triggered by volcanic activity. The intensity of combustion, combined with acidic precipitation, sterilized soils across vast expanses, leaving only a few hardy cryptogams and small vascular plants to recolonize. These survivors bore adaptations unusual for the period: deep root penetration, rapid spore release, and chemical defenses against lingering toxins. Every burned landscape became a laboratory of natural selection, where only the most resilient organisms could endure the immediate aftermath of the planetary conflagration. Oceans, stripped of oxygen, harbored only microscopic survivors, navigating dense, nutrient-poor waters. Fossil records of conodonts and foraminifera indicate severe population bottlenecks, with drastic reductions in diversity. Marine predators, from early fish to ammonoids, were nearly extirpated, leaving ecosystems dominated by microbes, algae, and sporadic small invertebrates. Geochemical analyses reveal spikes in sulfur isotopes and carbon anomalies, reflecting widespread oceanic anoxia and acidification. Even shallow reefs, once vibrant with brachiopods and mollusks, collapsed under these conditions. Life in the seas became a precarious negotiation with chemistry, temperature, and scarcity, establishing the foundations for future marine recovery. Predatory dominance vanished, leaving isolated insects and small amphibians as tenuous custodians of the land. These creatures occupied ecological niches, vacated by larger, extinct therapsids and amphibians, facing less competition but heightened vulnerability to environmental extremes. Fossilized trackways indicate careful, deliberate movement across sun-baked soils, with repeated attempts to locate water, shade, or shelter. Nutrient cycles had slowed drastically, with decomposition mediated almost entirely by microbes. Even the smallest predator-prey interactions now held disproportionate influence over the structure of post-catastrophe ecosystems, shaping survival strategies for species clinging to tenuous footholds in a world otherwise emptied of life. Fossilized skeletal remains reveal prolonged stress, with growth rings compressed and bone structure weakened. Survivors bore stunted limbs, reduced cranial capacity, and signs of metabolic strain, indicating generations of adaptation under severe oxygen and nutritional stress. Paleontological evidence points to shifts in reproductive strategies, with species producing fewer offspring but investing in higher survival potential per individual. The collapse of food webs left many survivors reliant on opportunistic feeding, scavenging, and temporary refuges. These physiological and behavioral traces provide insight into the resilience of life when exposed to multifactorial environmental catastrophe, demonstrating the limits and flexibility of Permian biota. Dusty plains bore subtle imprints of cautious movement, evidence of creatures mapping a perilous new world. Insects, small vertebrates, and plant propagules navigated a landscape dominated by barren soils, fragmented vegetation, and sporadic pools. Wind-borne spores, seeds, and eggs became crucial vectors for survival and recolonization. Evidence of burrows and shallow nests suggests behavioral adaptations to extreme heat, predation, and desiccation. These traces form a map of resilience, revealing patterns of movement, refuge, and dispersal that would shape evolutionary trajectories for millennia. Each mark in the dust represented both risk and opportunity in the fragile post-catastrophe world. Scattered oases of life, lichen-coated rocks, and microbial mats became essential hubs for recovery. These microhabitats served as refuges for amphibians, arthropods, and emerging plant shoots, maintaining genetic diversity in isolated pockets. Chemical analyses of preserved deposits indicate localized mitigation of acidity and toxic elements, allowing select species to thrive. Fossil evidence shows repeated colonization and abandonment cycles, illustrating the precarious balance between survival and extinction. These oases were both laboratories and lifeboats, demonstrating that even in near-total ecological collapse, microenvironments offered the first sparks of renewal and evolutionary experimentation. A quiet persistence threaded through every remaining lineage, hinting at the evolutionary stories yet to emerge. Microbes evolved metabolic innovations to exploit chemical niches, plants developed heat and drought tolerance, and animals optimized for scarce resources. Paleontological data indicate that these survivors carried traits that would become critical in post-Permian radiations. Genetic bottlenecks, while reducing diversity, also concentrated adaptations that allowed life to capitalize on open ecological space once environmental conditions stabilized. In these faintly lit corridors of survival, the seeds of Mesozoic ecosystems were being sown, invisible but potent, foreshadowing the slow rebound from planetary catastrophe. Even in the pervasive silence, the echoes of terror persisted in the chemical, geological, and biological record. Ash-laden soils, eroded channels, and mineralized sediments stood as enduring archives of the calamity. Fossilized remains bore witness to the intensity of selective pressures, demonstrating how life that survived had been tested to its limits. Yet the resilience embedded in these lineages ensured continuity, offering the first chapters of a renewed evolutionary narrative. The Permian nightmare, in extinguishing so much, paradoxically set the stage for the dawn of new ecosystems, leaving an indelible mark on the trajectory of life itself. In the aftermath of fire, flood, and suffocating skies, silence stretches across a world forever changed. Fragile remnants of life cling to shadowed valleys and poisoned waters, a testament to endurance amidst unimaginable chaos. The Permian nightmare reveals not just the terror of extinction, but the tenacity woven into the fabric of life itself. Shadows of a once ravaged earth linger in every scorched plain and darkened ocean, reminding us that survival is both fleeting and miraculous. Like, comment, and subscribe to share your thoughts and explore more prehistoric stories.